Frairen sat in the training bay silently after each of the Yorpal runts stepped out. She was seething. Her fur, ears, and tail stood on end, and she took long, deep breaths that did nothing to cool the heat coiled in her chest. The words she exchanged with her elders still replayed in her mind, making her even more angry. She sat on the bleachers alone as she stewed. She held her knees against her chest and hid her face in the space in between. The only thing that snapped her out of that anger was the sound of the door to the training area sliding open again. Great. It was probably someone coming to tell her to get back to bed. Rest was important. She was disturbing the peace of people trying to actually sleep. Something like that. If it was one of the runts coming to apologize, she might just have bit their head off. That person didn't say a thing as they walked over and sat down next to Frairen on the bleachers. The scent was hard to make out when her face was buried in legs, but Frairen would recognize it anywhere. Specialist Rayburn. "I'm guessing you're the one who sent those pups packing," she said with a teasing edge. Frairen took a long, deep breath and let out a long, deep sigh. She raised her head out from between her legs and chest and looked Rayburn in the eye. "I did." Frairen replied simply, though Rayburn wasn't going to accept such a simple answer. They both knew that. "Uh-huh. So, what'd they do? I want all the tea," Rayburn insisted. She gave Frairen a few light, playful punches on the arm. Maybe the Yorpal would bite someone else's head off while she was obviously so pissed, but suddenly her teeth felt dull. They were far busier biting back any potential annoyance. That fury was apparently more obvious than Frairen thought. Rayburn reached up with her hands to squish and rub Frairen's cheeks. "It'd be easier if you didn't clench your jaw so tight," she teased, and Frairen found her jaw actually unclenching. She even laughed as a smidge of the fire within her smoldered. Well, it was a bit complicated. One of them brought me here. I thought she just wanted me to help her train, but then 2 other Yorpal joined her and demanded that I speak to the elders," Frairen said with disdain. That anger was quickly simmering back to life. Rayburn's teasing, carefree expression quickly shifted to one of concern. She took her hands off Frairen, but she decided to leave one on the Yorpal's shoulder, giving it a soft squeeze. "I'm surprised they had the balls to try again. What was it this time?" she asked. Frairen put her hand over Rayburn's, leaning against her human as she let out another frustrated huff. "They demanded I go back to Dagmar Prime. They said it was my duty." Something finally hit Frairen as she recounted what happened to Rayburn. "A duty to my family." She trailed off slowly. That black and white bastard put extra emphasis on that word, and now it was rubbing Frairen the wrong way, grating in her mind like nails on a chalkboard. There were only so many reasons why he would do that. Rayburn noticed how Frairen's ears perked up at some internal realization. Frairen gasped. Her fur stood on end again, and her hands clenched into fists as sudden strain spread throughout her body. "Tell me what's going on in that beautiful head of yours, Frairen," Rayburn urged. I think they're gonna do something to my sister," Frairen spat out in return. The fact that she wouldn't be able to do anything about it if they decided the time was now made her nauseous. Her brain ran quickly through ways to get to Dagmar Prime as fast as possible, but Rayburn dragged her out of her thoughts again with another, firmer squeeze. "Frairen, relax," she ordered. Frairen knew that tone. She had used it herself just moments ago. "We need to stay focused if we want to talk about it, and that's not going to get any easier if you start freaking out on me." Frairen forced her breathing to calm down at Rayburn's command. The Yorpal's shoulders were still tense, her fur still stood on end, and her eyes were still wide. Rayburn definitely noticed, and she grabbed Frairen's chin to force eye contact as she continued. "Breathe with me. In and out. Slowly. If I see you rushing, then I'll force you to relax in a different way. In and out. Very slowly." The pair stared at each other as they breathed, Rayburn leading and Frairen following. Each breath brought another hit of Rayburn's soothing scent, and her hand on Frairen's chin kept the Yorpal grounded. When Frairen's fur finally started to smooth back down, Rayburn's smile returned. "Let's lay on the ground and talk," Rayburn said plainly, not a hint of hesitation in her voice. Before Frairen could even question it, Rayburn had already pulled her to the hard floor. She arranged themselves where Frairen had to crane her neck all the way up to look at anything other than Rayburn's head beside hers. Despite how strange it was, Frairen couldn't help but admit that it was a little nice, at least. It was a way to physically take the weight off her shoulders, and she couldn't hunch over easily like this. Frairen turned her head to say something, but Rayburn had already closed her eyes as she continued to simply breathe. Frairen continued to follow her lead, closing her eyes as well. "Do you lay down on the floor like this often?" Frairen asked, trying to redirect her thoughts. Rayburn chuckled. Her back bounced lightly against the floor. "Only for you," Rayburn replied. Frairen chuckled, her tail thumping sheepishly against the floor. "I'll keep that in mind," Frairen said. She's going to have to hold Rayburn to that, and Rayburn didn't protest. She looked forward to the banter later. "You know, I'd never let anything happen to you and yours, right? I don't care how big the universe is, or how fast the war wave moves, or whoever threatens to sweep you up in it." Rayburn crossed her arms confidently. "I'd rip them to shreds." She finished, with enough certainty to replace the chill of anxiety in Frairen with warmth. Frairen wholeheartedly believed her. Humans were scary. Only fools would forget how they ripped the Deermere apart when the insectoid monsters were ravaging the galaxy. Frairen experienced firsthand how these fleshy psychopaths trained, shooting at their own force to keep their nerve. She'd grown to admire it, to thrive in the same chaotic messes the humans reveled in. That bloodlust had rubbed off on her tenfold, and it made the other Yorpal quiver. She almost couldn't wait to continue showing her kind how they were flawed to doubt or fear the humans. Though such ambitious thoughts were still alien to Frairen, they needed to have time to exercise. Thank you for everything, Rayburn," Frairen whispered, and two hands grabbed the sides of her face again. They deftly tilted her head, and she felt a light kiss on the tip of her nose before she could even open her eyes. When she did, Frairen saw Rayburn at the strange angle she put them in, smiling widely and holding Frairen's face. Frairen smiled herself. Her tail wagged hard against the floor in a steady rhythm. "Just point me in the direction, and I'll help you topple whatever crooked government you need," Rayburn said with a mischievous chuckle. Frairen's smile widened further. "You humans are a bad influence. You actually make me think I can make a difference," Frairen said absent-mindedly. Rayburn's brow furrowed immediately after that. She quickly pinched both of Frairen's cheeks, earning a sharp yip from the Yorpal. "Don't be stupid. You've done more than those elders of yours have done in your and their lifetimes combined," Rayburn scolded. She freed Frairen off her scolding pinches soon after, patting the Yorpal's cheeks. It's probably true to some extent. Maybe the elders had political power, but Frairen could snap them over her knee if she got the chance. Oh, how she wished for the chance to snap at least one of them. "I guess you have a point. I might even be coming for the one thing they're good at. Influence." The female Yorpal that left looked like she was ready to become kawaii. Frairen relented. Rayburn raised a brow in surprise, but her surprise quickly melted into her playful smirk. "And we humans are supposed to be the bad influence," Rayburn teased, as she poked Frairen's nose. Frairen scoffed and rolled her eyes in jest. "You are, but really I would be more than happy to drag more Yorpals away from those tail-biting morons," Frairen said with obvious dripping malice. Her anger started to flare up once more. It wasn't anywhere near as intense as before her conversation with Rayburn, but it was just enough to start getting her fired up again. The embers in her eyes didn't go unnoticed either. "You're already in a good position to start doing that, aren't you? Maybe this little pup could be a test drive. Get her, and you'll start a fire that could track back to the powder keg you call home," Rayburn said. She folded her arms across her chest now that the conversation shifted once more. Frairen considered the suggestion. She wasn't really plotting on her elder's downfall before, but now? If they really were threatening her sister, she'd make sure they had hell to pay. Maybe it would be better to start the fire sooner rather than later. "I'll have to take that into consideration," Frairen said with a voice that made it clear she'd been taking it into more than just consideration. Rayburn grinned, letting out a sharp laugh. She redirected her attention back to the ceiling. "Your tail is wagging, Frairen. You've got to work on that before even thinking about scheming," Rayburn teased as she closed her eyes again. Frairen groaned and looked over to the damn appendage that continuously gave her away. Her mortal enemy. It gave her away in poker. It gave her away while she was scheming. What else was it going to expose her for? Rayburn stood up as Frairen glared at her tail, and the human extended a hand to help Frairen get up. "Let's get back to bed before someone less forgiving comes to shove you off to the infirmary," she said playfully. Frairen took her hand and stood up, knowing that she was lucky that Rayburn was the one to come across her so late in the stimulated night. "Right. I think you're the only reason no one else has shown up. The other Yorpal probably thought you were the one coming to chew me out," Frairen said in a half-joking manner. Rayburn chuckled, keeping her hand in Frairen's as she led them out of the training area. She would bite back at least one comment, but one other came to mind as they started to make their way back to the infirmary, just when the silence was becoming comforting. "Oh, I also promise not to get jealous if you really want to convert that Lady Yorpal to the dark side," Rayburn said out of nowhere. She even had the audacity to wink. Frairen's brows shot up, but this time she wouldn't be so easily flustered. "Enough is enough. You've been teasing me all night. You're lucky I can't show you that dark side." Frairen shot back in an exaggerated tone, emphasizing her point with a slap to Rayburn's butt. Rayburn gasped. The audacity, the pain. She rubbed the spot Frairen slapped dramatically. "After all I've done for you, and yet you treat me like a cheap lady of the night," Rayburn replied dramatically, only to quickly lose her composure, descending into quiet laughter. Frairen's grip on Rayburn's hand tightened instinctively as she followed Rayburn into a quiet fit of chuckles. The pair continued on with their banter to the infirmary. For now, they were blissfully unaware of what was going on in the underbelly of the big-mouth bass. The warm atmosphere faded upon going deeper into the depths of the big-mouth bass. Ideally, little to no warmth would penetrate the bowels of the large vessel, and that was made clear whenever some unfortunate soul would get stuck to the freezing metal lining the long hallway to the morgue. The freezer. The hallway was long, and cold enough for any unfamiliar face to realize that they were heading in the wrong direction, well before they'd be confronted by the dull smell of death. Beyond the smell of heavy, intense chemicals used to clean the freezer around the clock, the stench of something new pierced through the cold. It slunk around every corner, creeping into the nostrils of the unfortunate mortuary assistants who'd volunteered a long time ago to aid the war effort in a more solemn way. They just never anticipated the methods humans used to be so barbaric. 3 assistants, a Poit, a Yorpal, and a Karlak, smeared a generous amount of peppermint oil on the inside of the masks to desperately try to avoid the stench of death. Their human mortician, Lawrence, insisted that they didn't lean on such a crutch, but the Star citizens were insistent, especially the beige female Yorpal, who was still reeling in the corner of the room, propping herself up against the desk on the opposite side of the room from the door. The longest of the walls on either side of the group were lined to the brim with compartments that housed the bodies of fallen soldiers. The morgue housed a new kind of corpse this time, though. It wasn't often that the corpse of an enemy would be kept in the freezer. Maybe they would need to cut a key out of a stomach once or twice, but never to perform a proper autopsy. One of the compartments was bigger than the rest. It was the size of 2 regular compartments, used to jettison unwanted material out into space. Obnoxiously bright tape marked the thing, just to make sure that no one would accidentally trap themselves. The corpse of the hour laid on the operating table in the center of the room. His name didn't matter anymore. Lawrence read quietly over the clipboard that held a few notes relevant to the corpse. Apparently, this mandarine's brain should be liquefied. Says he hasn't been dead for very long, but he already smells like he's been dead for weeks. Lawrence observed in amusement. The point assistant finished organizing the tools necessary for the examination on a small cart. He glanced toward his much more perturbed Yorpal companion before wheeling the cart over to Lawrence. Lawrence nodded toward the point, nudging him to stand on the opposite side of the mandarine corpse. The Karlakian assistant, Akshibar, dragged a corkboard behind the point, Hjorel. Lawrence always insisted on using something called a Polaroid, little snippets of time captured in a small square, surrounded in white borders. One more instance of humans preferring tech that the Star citizens had moved past millennia ago. His assistants never commented on it. They would rather keep their relationship positive with the human that seemed to have more than a few screws loose. Lawrence, wearing an all-too-pleased grin, pointed to the Yorpal, Nefre, hiding in the corner of the room. "Come here and take a look, my fuzzy friend. You're here to learn, aren't you?" Lawrence beckoned. Nefre was practically shaking. She wasn't willing to get closer to the smell that was still assaulting her sensitive nose. But Lawrence's beckoning finger made it clear she had no choice. As the Yorpal approached, Lawrence quickly wrapped his arm around her shoulders and trapped her against his side. He traced his finger slowly across the curve of the mandarine's chest. "What do you see?"
"I see that the skin is discolored. He has plenty of scars, but otherwise looks like an ordinary mandarine?"
Nefre stuttered. At this proximity, she could barely stomach the smell. The peppermint oil was doing little to stave off the scent from her keen nose. Each of the Star citizens jumped back in shock as Lawrence's finger sunk easily into the corpse's abdomen. "Ordinary?" Lawrence barked out a laugh. "Hardly. Maybe you need to clear out your eyes, my dear friend. The skin is soft and brittle, and it's only been a day," he continued. Lawrence spun the Yorpal away as he pulled out his own Polaroid camera to start taking pictures. The meticulous human took a picture from every angle he could manage, even pictures that forced him to twist or lay in awkward positions. Akshibar stepped forward once Lawrence finished, temporarily retreating from the corpse to store the pictures. The Karlake retrieved a needle from the cart to attempt to draw a blood sample from the strange corpse, if there was anything left. She managed to get something. The blood was a bright red at first, but it quickly transitioned into a brackish brown, sloughing into the needle and mixing with the red liquid already inside. The brown liquid moved sluggishly, had congealed to the point where it penetrated the red blood in the form of thick bubbles. Lawrence grabbed Akshibar's wrist to pull the syringe up to his eye. "Interesting. How extremely interesting." Lawrence glanced toward the mandarine's waist. "Considering we're missing the distinct release of his bowels, it's safe to assume there's nothing left down there. Greedy bastard," he said, almost disappointed by the revelation. He plucked the syringe from the Karlake's hand, hurrying it into cold storage. "Sir?" the point mumbled, hoping his small voice would go unnoticed, but, of course, Lawrence locked onto him like a hawk. His eyes gleamed brightly, with the same excitement that bounced off of the scalpel Hjorel held nervously in his hand. Lawrence stepped over, guiding the point to the top of a wooden block next to the body. "You want to make the first incision, then?" "How brave of you," Lawrence said in a much too cheery tone. Hjorell froze up as he looked down at the body. His plan to hand Lawrence the scalpel had somehow backfired. Of course it did. It always did when it came to Lawrence. The human was already marking the places for Hjorell to cut into the corpse. "Enjoy, my friend. Make the first cuts count," he urged playfully, motioning to the corpse. Hjorell's hand shook as he inched the scalpel closer to the marked flesh. What god could he have possibly offended to work with this psychopath? Not all humans were like this, right? Surely not. If they were, then there was simply no way any species with a semblance of intelligence would work with them. The blade of the scalpel timidly grazed the skin, which gave in easily to the minute amount of force. Hjorell didn't move any further than that. He could feel his hands shaking hard, and he knew the consequences for messing up Lawrence's precise and pristine lines. While the Poit hesitated, the Carliac rolled her eyes, taking the scalpel from Hjorell. "Let me do it for you, you buffoon," she hissed, as she made the first incision. She dragged the blade easily across the lines, but her graceful cut was interrupted by Lawrence grabbing her wrist. He held a finger up to his lips in a hushing motion, a motion that the Star citizens were now keenly familiar with from working with the human. Akshabar paused obediently. Her blade stayed partially embedded in the corpse's skin. Lawrence simply pressed his ear against the clavicle, as silence blanketed the room. The Yorpal's ears perked up as well to listen, but it was more than difficult to stay focused as the smell got worse. It made her eyes water. She had to choke down a gag as Lawrence investigated whatever noise he had managed to pick up. It didn't take him long to lean back with an even wider grin. A low hiss filled the air around them. A hiss, and a rattle which sounded eerily similar to a snake's. Hjorell's eyes widened, and Akshabar's head inched back into her hood, while Nefre simply tried to fight the urge to coat her mask in another layer of peppermint oil. Lawrence guided Akshabar's hand to drag the scalper further along the line, and the hiss grew louder, while the smell grew stronger. The Mandarain's chest heaved, and his lips parted to let out one last ragged breath before his chest collapsed entirely. Lawrence frowned in disappointment at the simple death rattle, but it was quickly swept away by a new sound. He pushed Akshabar's hand away, opting to simply stick his hand into the incision. His assistants looked on in a mix of horror and concern. "Sir, this isn't protocol," Akshabar said urgently, though she didn't dare to try to stop him. "To hell with protocol! Does this look like protocol to any of you?" Lawrence retorted, as he felt around the corpse. The Mandarain's skin bulged as Lawrence's knuckles and arms pressed against the corpse's chest. The Star citizens looked on in horror, watching as Lawrence's fingers walked along the ribs. He eventually perked up, his back straightened up while his hands stilled on something inside the Mandarain's chest. "How interesting," he droned, retracting his arm from inside the corpse. His fascination blinded him from the swiftly retreating form of Nefre rushing out of the freezer. Hjorell followed her with his gaze, reaching out to grab her, but far too slow to reach her in time. "Nefre, you need to—" Hjorell said sharply, but the Yorpal wasn't going to stop now. Akshabar didn't bother trying to stop Nefre. Her focus was solely on Lawrence. The scalpel glided through the Mandarain's skin with practiced ease. "What did you feel, Lawrence?" Akshabar asked quietly, careful not to disturb Lawrence. His focus wouldn't be broken so easily, though, and his grin only grew wider as he traced along the line. The human cut along the Mandarain's clavicle with ease, before trailing the scalpel down the corpse's stomach. A subtle glow radiated from the thin cuts left behind by Lawrence's handiwork, and the stench grew even stronger. Hjorell pressed his mask closer to his nose, trying to drown out the stench in an overwhelming wave of peppermint. Akshabar simply watched intently. She made mental notes of each small correction Lawrence made in his cutting. "It's warm, my dear. I felt something warm." Lawrence finished the cut. "Help me peel it," he ordered. The human took off one of the now free flaps of flesh, and Akshabar followed his lead. Together, the two peeled back the flesh of the mandarine's chest and stomach. With the mandarine's innards exposed to the air, the group could peer into an open cavity. The organs inside were slightly withered, dying and unhealthy, yet far past the stage of decay they should have been in. The freezer's crew had seen the insides of a mandarine before. While everything was in order, there was an extra little mucus inside the corpse. It was like a thick orange jelly that coated the sad, shriveled organs. The jelly formed into gelatinous bubbles that nestled themselves between the heart and lungs. A thick rope of the substance snaked its way in the space around the mandarine's intestines. Lawrence didn't hesitate to dip his finger down into it, only for the jelly to recoil more violently than would be anticipated. The jelly shook violently against Lawrence's touch, and he quickly noticed a dark shape within disappear deeper into the orange mass. Lawrence's eyes brightened in delight at the sight of the unknown masses and creatures. Each of the pockets of jelly shivered from the contact, and something behind the organs shifted in frustration. Akshabar and Hiorel looked on in horror, stunned by what they were seeing. Lawrence simply moved on to his next fascination, moving the intestines aside with a surprising amount of care to not disturb the jelly deposits. The atrophy the intestines already underwent made it simple to keep them out of the way, revealing the spine behind them. A tail tipped with a sharp spike was wrapped around the mandarine's spine, and the pointed tip of the tail partially embedded itself into the bone. Lawrence looked on in a mix of fascination and disbelief, outstretching his palm to the star citizens and snapping his fingers. While Hiorel's overwhelmed mind had no idea what the human wanted, Akshabar simply handed him a pair of rib cutters. Lawrence worked quickly after that, snapping the mandarine's thick ribs in the metal jaws of the cutters and carefully extracting the front of the rib cage. Whatever creatures lurked within the jelly hissed and buzzed with growing hostility, threatening to retaliate against Lawrence's curiosity. Once the front of the rib cage was extracted, Lawrence handed it to Akshabar for disposal. He handed Hiorel the camera next. "Here, I think you'll be more useful taking pictures this time around," Lawrence teased, tapping Hiorel on the forehead. It didn't take a genius to realize that the poet wouldn't be doing much else during the autopsy. The cold wasn't even necessary for freezing him to the block he stood on. This way, he would just have to worry about getting the best angles possible for pictures of this peculiar corpse. The poet set off hesitantly. He wouldn't be able to bend the same way Lawrence does, but his pictures would be serviceable, at least. Lawrence directed his attention back to the corpse. He took a pair of scissors to start cutting the jelly away. Lawrence's cutting had started to catch the attention of whatever creature's tail was coiled around the spine now. The tail tightened around the spine, scraping rough skin against hard bone. The jelly deposits moved more rapidly and consistently, shifting as the creatures inside pressed against the stretchy membrane. It didn't do much to deter Lawrence, though, and he continued cutting one of the sacs until it separated from the organs around it. The sac felt like holding a thick, squishier water balloon. Akshabar took the sac from Lawrence just in time for the corpse's chest to lurch forward. The mandarine groaned. Its bones cracked back into place as it seemingly sprung back to life. The corpse's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, keen and spiteful, but not the same as its living kin. It turned sharply to Lawrence, its mouth curling into an uneven smile, like the thing inside didn't have total control of its lips. The corpse sat up like some invisible creature was testing out its skin suit for the first time.
"Child of Leviathan, what an honor to witness the glow of your arrogance in the flesh."
The corpse's voice boomed. Its arms stretched out one segment at a time. First the upper arm, then the forearm, then the hand and each little finger on it.
"Hezteth claim you, and weave your guts."
The mandarine started to continue, but a swift punch to his jaw sent the corpse reeling and falling over the opposite side of the table. It fell to the ground with a mix of flesh against metal and bones cracking out of place. Lawrence didn't hesitate to leap up onto the table and jump down to kick the corpse again. The corpse didn't cry out in pain, but the sacs remaining inside bursted open, spilling thick orange fluid across the ground as insects swarmed out of the mandarine's chest. The corpse took the opportunity to grab onto Lawrence's leg while he batted away the large insects that swarmed him. Its fingers strained upward, and sharp bones shot out of the mandarine's fingers, changing into hastily formed claws. Even in the heat of the moment, Akshabar could recognize the new structure as almost identical to her own hands. The corpse dug its newly formed claw into the meat of Lawrence's calf, though the human wrenched his leg free before the corpse had the chance to cut him too badly. Lawrence met the mandarine's effort to cut him by stomping his foot down on the hastily formed claw, smashing it into the ground. At the same time, Lawrence swatted away the bugs that tried desperately to pull on his cheeks, lips, or hair, whatever part of their face that they could reach. Rather than being concerned about the sudden attack, Lawrence found himself more concerned about losing too much of the corpse. He could beat it into a pulp, but pulps were much less interesting than reanimated corpses. Lawrence thinned the swarm significantly, while the corpse struggled against his foot that was pinning it down. More of the sacs bursted open as the corpse dragged itself backwards, allowing more insects to swarm up into the cold air. Those that survived more than a few seconds moved sluggishly in the cold. Instead of all swarming Lawrence, some of the insects turned their attention to the star citizens. Hjorell looked at the scene with wide eyes, and he dropped the Polaroid camera out of his shaking hands before bolting out of the morgue. A small swarm of insects flew or crawled after the poet. A mix of panicked footsteps and furious wing beats echoed down the hallway. Akshabar responded more proactively. She grabbed a bone saw from the cart and started cutting down the insects alongside Lawrence. The large corpses dropped to the ground in pieces, or with deep craters in their exoskeletons. Lawrence grinned when the Karlak joined the fight rather than running with her tail between her legs.
"This is why you're my favorite,"
Lawrence shouted over the noise of their chaotic battle. The mandarine's corpse wriggled free of Lawrence's pin, sacrificing its lower half so its upper half could gain some ground from the human. Its spine trailed behind it, with the tail of the creature coiling tightly around what was left. Organs gave way to just the essentials that the mandarine needed to move. Bones, muscles, and whatever skin stubbornly stuck to the corpse. It laughed at the sight of the chaos, using its one good arm to back away before bones rearranged themselves once more.
"You don't even know what's festering under your noses, nor you or those you hold dear,"
the corpse said with a strained, raspy voice. Whatever air it had gotten away with left its lungs once it had torn itself in half to escape the human. The last of its air was wheezed out in a crazed laugh, and it turned to slam its empty stomach into the ground, using its good arm to start dragging itself through the freezer and into the hallway that would lead into the rest of the ship. A trail of the orange jelly was left in the corpse's wake, along with the underdeveloped bodies of half-formed insects that joined the corpses of their dead kin scattered along the ground. Lawrence's attention was immediately caught by the corpse's words. They would have been foreboding if Lawrence was a part of a weaker species, and if it wasn't said in such a weak voice. There was no way he could allow it to drag itself out of this situation, though. His shipmates wouldn't hesitate to obliterate such a heinous creature, especially if Hjorell managed to call for help, and he wouldn't have time to explain that he needed it alive, or whatever state of life was closest to what it was. Lawrence threw one of the insect corpses to Akshabar, who was thankfully ready to cut it in half before it could hit her.
"You got this. I believe in you,"
Lawrence yelled over his shoulder while he turned to run after the corpse, splitting the swarm of insects around him. Akshabar watched in semi-disbelief as her human companion ran after the corpse crawling through the hallway. He just left her. He seriously just left her in the morgue with the swarm of insects that was attacking her and half of the swarm that was attacking him. Part of her was flattered that a human considered her capable enough to handle a bunch of insects half the size of a poet, but another part of her was burned with anger, hot enough to melt Lawrence's retreating form. Was he serious? Lawrence was very serious. He chased after the corpse unrelentingly, following the trail of orange jelly like a bloodhound. The corpse couldn't move very fast with one arm and half of its body missing, so Lawrence managed to catch up quickly, while he batted away the insects or simply ignored them. He hoisted the corpse into his arms, using the remaining ribs as a handhold to keep it up against his chest. The corpse struggled fiercely in Lawrence's grasp. Its remaining hand extended into another claw, and it dragged the sharp tips of bone across Lawrence's forearm, delighted by the sight of the human's blood. The creature's tail made the spine thrash wildly, and the vertebrae were forced apart as the spiked tail stabbed into Lawrence's thigh. It wiggled and twisted to make sure to cause as much pain as possible. The corpse arched forward as far as it could, wrapping itself around the human's arms as spiked bone shot out of its back and pierced through Lawrence's chest. It should kill him. Between the blood loss and the shock of the pain, any creature would die to the corpse's last act of defiance. Yet, the child of Leviathan refused the fall. The corpse's confidence finally began to falter as it felt its bony weapons twist, crack, and break off of itself while still being lodged in the human's muscle. Lawrence dropped the stunned corpse to the ground with a heavy thud. The corpse was tattered, to put it lightly. Even if it wanted to move at this point, it had damaged itself too much to go any further. Lawrence took his time as he circled the thing, looking down at it with an expression twisted in barely restrained rage. Despite the bones lodged in his body, the human walked as if they weren't even there. He cracked his knuckles, stretched his muscles, and even inspected the bones the corpse had attacked him with. A streak of fear raced up the corpse's back, for the first time as this monster leaned over it. He reached down to tentatively trace what was left of the mandarine's back. His pointer finger and middle finger stepped up each remaining vertebrae, before settling on the tail wrapped around the spinal cord. Lawrence wrapped his hand around the bone and tail, drawing it out as long as he could. He let the fear set in, as the pieces slowly fell into place for the creature within. Before it could react, Lawrence yanked the mandarine's spine free from its body, as if he were ripping up paper. He caught the skull as it flew back, along with the sharp motion. The lower half of the skull was normal, but the top half was another, larger insect that squealed and wiggled fruitlessly to escape. Lawrence held the creature's tail tightly. The massacred corpse below him was an unfortunate loss, but this creature was much more interesting. The insect was stout. It fitted snugly on the top of the skull while its long tail, far longer than the rest of its body, snaked around the spinal cord. It wove itself in between each of the nerves. Lawrence turned to take the thing back to the freezer. He was going to find a temporary place to store it, as well as help out the Karlak he'd left behind. But small footsteps made him pause. Almost vomiting from the sight of the massacre, Hjorell returned with human backup, though they realized they weren't needed. Lawrence simply smiled as he held the panicking capture upside down by the tail, like a twisted, prized fish.
Hjorell, you've got a lot to clean up, my friend.